Let's talk about 1 Peter. I'll take you through the purpose of the book, and then I'll take you through the 3 literary sections that are found in the book, concluding with a beautiful part he has on how all of us have to build our minds individually so that collectively we can have solidarity, that we can have unity, and that we can have an impact on our cities and on our culture. So let's take a look now at 1 Peter. So Peter, as we start here, let's look at where Peter fits inside the whole canon. So we have the New Testament here in 27 letters, and we've got Paul's letters. We need to know where Peter fits before we begin. So we've got Paul's letters here with his early, middle, and late. And then we have John's letters, of course. We know John and 1st, 2nd, 3rd John in Revelation. And then we have what we call the Petrine Circle, or what's called the Petrine Circle of letters. And that includes James, Peter, and Jude. That's Jesus' 2 brothers, Jude and James. And Mark and Matthew, also written, and Hebrews also written to the dispersed Jews. And that's why it makes up the Petrine Circle. And then those 4 books, Jude, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, along with John's letters, make up what's called in research the Corpus Apostolicum. But Peter fits, let's focus on Peter here. Peter fits in with James and Jude, and they're all written to dispersed Jews, those that come out of Acts 2 at Pentecost. So let's jump back in now to the specifics of 1 Peter. If I zoom back out here, let me show you the whole picture of what we're going to do first. We've got the purpose statement and some of the references of how it's like the book of Ephesians up here in the top left. We'll go through that first. Then we'll talk about his first literary section, which is through 1:1 through 2:10. And we'll talk about the 2 items he has in here, which is living hope and living stones. His second literary section, his second core argument, is that we have to live as God's household. And that's in 2:11 through 3:12, and how we live in our households then impact our communities, our cities, states, and even our countries, and having strong republics. And then finally, he ends with solidarity and community. And how do you do that? By building a state of mind in how we all are to think. So let's start in the top left here. 1 Peter, in that collection of all the letters in the Petrine Circle of letters, 1 Peter is the core. This letter is the manifesto, if you will. Kind of like Ephesians is the core letter in all of Paul's letters, you can find that it explains the core framework of Christ's plan. It has the centrality of the church in it, and it's essential to all the other letters. So think of 1 Peter like Ephesians in that sense. And Peter writes to encourage the Jewish diaspora, that is the Jewish people who are dispersed. They came to Pentecost, they received the Holy Spirit, they received Christ, and now they went back to their own hometowns. They were dispersed, and now we're 30-ish years later, and they're in danger of returning to their former Jewish faith. And so Peter is telling them to stand firm and to stay in the teaching and to not lose hope. So he tells them that by being a living hope and being living stones, and to live in Christ's household, and to have unity and solidarity in their community. That's what he's up to. He says his purpose statement really in 1:1. He says, I'm an apostle to the dispersed again in Pontus, Galatia, and he goes on here. And if you look at that, that is, I've got a misspelled word there. He's got the same, if you look at Acts 2, it's the same people groups that you find in Acts 2. Also, we should take note that Peter his work, Luke follows his work, his activity in the first chapters of Acts, 1 through 12. And also we pick up a little bit from Paul in Galatians 2, 7 through 8. This is primarily about their conflict around the gospel, the kerygma. But we know a lot about Peter from definitely the Acts, the pieces of Acts, and in the gospel books themselves. So Peter's purpose, though, in this letter is found in the first verse. First Peter, some other context things here, is First Peter assumes an understanding of most of Paul's letters, but especially Ephesians. He talks about Paul's letters, especially in 2 Peter here, and says that Paul had wisdom when he wrote. And so we have to understand at least the framework of Paul's letters, and especially Ephesians. Peter's driving motivation is focused on remaining strong and not returning back to the religious systems of the Jews and the Hebrew system, or even to cave into the cultural situation that they find themselves in. That is the double bind that they're in, that you see the book of James talks about as well, which is, again, in this same collection of letters. And Peter uses a Greco-Roman and a dispersion letter form of writing, which, again, we talked about in the letter of James. If you want to see what makes up a Greco-Roman letter and how do we know the forms of diaspora, you can find that in there. Now let's get into, we've got the purpose of Peter. So now let's go into the first literary section, big chunks, if you will, big core items. We have to know the big pieces of what the author is doing in every book if we're going to ever try to understand the sentences that are inside the book. We have to pursue the author's intended meaning first, not what we think the word means or phrases or paragraphs mean, but instead what the author himself and ultimately the Spirit is telling us. So the first thing is a living hope. If you look at chapter 1, verse 3 through chapter 2, 3, you see he describes the living hope. He says this living hope, this gospel, is rooted in the prophets of the Old Testament. And he says, prepare your mind for action. He's starting to talk about how this is about your mind and a battle for your mind and how you have to train your mind and discipline your mind. So let's go through those very briefly. He says we've been given a new birth, an inheritance, protected by the power of God, and he's describing that hope. He says the gospel is rooted in the prophets, and if you look at his 5 sermons in Acts, or his 5 messages that Luke records for us, Acts 2 at Pentecost he gives one, Cornelius' house, Acts 10 he gives another one. You can see he's got a formula. He doesn't say the gospel message the same every time, but he gives statements that give you a framework of the gospel, the good news. And this is what you see here in this box. And so then when you look at verses 3 through 21 in this portion of chapter 1, you see he's saying some of the same kerygma statements. There is so much integration and so much parallel that the authors, the apostles, are saying that it makes a beautiful, beautiful understanding for us and gives us a confidence in what Jesus continued to do and teach through his Spirit, through his apostles. Then he says, prepare your mind for action. He challenges them to be disciplined, to set your hope, to set your mind on things Jesus revealed. Be holy in your conduct. Let your conduct reveal your hope. Love one another deeply and long for the pure spiritual milk. Grow in your salvation. Then he moves on to talk about living stones. Like living stones and God's own people. He says, let yourself be built into a spiritual house. He's going to talk about being God's house here in a moment. And he says, be fully committed. These verses here, you can see about being built into a spiritual house, Peter drew upon and rooted these in the Old Testament prophets. The apostles knew the Old Testament. They knew the Old Covenant. They knew the books. They knew it. And Isaiah, he drew on Isaiah, Psalms, Hosea, and you can see them referenced over here. God's own people, they needed to become, he said, you are living stones. You're God's own people. You're God's selected people by becoming fully committed. And he's saying our ancestors missed Christ and the entire narrative, but now we're a new people built with Christ as the foundation. So be God's people. Okay, that's the first literary section broadly. Living hope and living stones. Now let's move to the second literary section. And here he's telling us, live as God's house. Be God's house. Well, what does that mean? And what did it mean to them, or what was their situation? Well, they were in a diaspora situation. They were dispersed, and they had to deal with unjust governments, unjust masters, unjust husbands. And so they have a culture that's against them, pushing against their faith, and their religious brothers and sisters who are in the Hebrew system are also pushing against them. And so Peter's is telling them to be God's house, be Christ's house, but there's a way you are to live and to be in Christ's house. So he says, honorably live in the community, that is your city. Honorably live with government institutions. Accept the authorities of your masters. He says, wives, accept the authorities of husbands. So he's starting at a community and city and even country level, and he's working his way down to the individual household. And then he says, husbands, pay honor to the wife, and together you are to have a unity of spirit, sympathy, love, tender hearts, humble minds. And what you see here is this 1 Peter 2, 22 to 25 integrates, and it builds upon what Isaiah is talking about in Isaiah 53. This plan is built upon Christ. We were going astray, but now we must stay in his created order with Christ as our shepherd. So this is very much the like what Paul is talking about. It's the same social structure. It's not like it. It is the same social structure. So if you look here at Ephesians 5:21 through 6:9, Colossians 3, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, and then compare that to 1 Peter 2:11 here through 3:12, you can see the older men, older women, younger women. There's a parallel. There's a way to live in our households that shows God's design, because it's designed based on how he created us and how he created us for a purpose. And living like this results in us engaging in good occupations in our city. Our occupations is actually for the benefit of our cities we live amongst and people we live amongst. We are then to meet the pressing needs in our city, and we're to have honorable households, and that will result in churches that function as families. If you look over here in this portion on the left, God has built his wisdom into creation, and human wisdom throughout the ages, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they can see it, but only those who follow his plan of households can actually achieve it. If we have strong households, and even today there's many governments, country governments, that recognize that in order to have a strong country, you have to have strong households. So strong households result in strong communities, cities. Strong communities or smaller regional locations result in strong cities and states. And strong cities and states produce strong republics. So republics are really held together by strong households. Okay, this is what Peter is doing in this section. It's a big section. There's a lot of content in there. But he's saying live as God's household in summary. In his final portion here, which is 3:13 through 5:15, 5:14, He's saying now, how are you going to respond? You're in a dispersed or a situation, a very dark and desperate situation. How are you going to respond? Because society is despising you. They're bringing false charges against them. They're maligned. They're abused. They're suffering. How are they going to respond? And he talks about that they need to build their mind, and he talks about some of their actions. So let's look at it. He says, in your immediate response to your suffering and to your abuse is respond with gentleness. Do not be intimidated. Overall, your response should be a good conduct. You should be doing good, and you should have a good conscience for what you are doing. He reminds them that Christ also suffered. He even died, but he did strike back in the sense of he was resurrected. And he says, appeal to God for a good conscience through the commitment of your faith. He's not saying you're saved there. He's saying that through your commitment to the teachings and through the commitment of having building your mind and living in God's household, you will bring solidarity to your church and to your family and to ultimately your community. He then says, which is really the most exciting part of 1 Peter here, and you can see it is referenced in his second letter as well. His second letter just comes alive once you understand this portion. He says, arm yourself with the same intentions. Arm yourself. And what he's talking about there is the same intentions. That means your beliefs. That means your values. That means your priorities. That means your intentions is your building your mind, building a complex state of mind, a way of thinking that's lined up with Christ. It's not any way of thinking. It's a specific way of thinking that lines up with Christ's teachings. Christ has a set of teachings, and when his Spirit came after Jesus went back up a second time, he released his Spirit. The apostles began to understand clearer and clearer, and they gave us these letters, and they said, follow these teachings. And one of these teachings is the household structure that Peter just got done with. He says, integrate your beliefs, your feelings, your values, your priorities. Even though your culture is going to have a xenos, that's the word surprised in there, and then later you have they're phobic against you. So that's where today we get the word xenophobia, that people are against other people just based on where they're from or the way they look, or they have a xenophobia against them. And he's saying you're going to have that, but you need to build your mind and be of the same mind. Arm yourself with the same intentions. He says, then be serious, discipline yourself constantly, love each other, be hospitable, serve each other with your gifts, speak to each other as if you're speaking to God, serve each other with the strength of God. Then down here on the left, he says, you're in a fiery ordeal. Here we go again. He's recognizing, hey, you're in a culturally desperate, dark situation, but this is just like Christ. And the culture is phobic against you. And you're being falsely accused, and you can't even defend yourself, but live honorably. And then he goes back to what he said in the second literary section here in the third. He says, remember, households are central. Elders amongst you must oversee the people. He goes into a little bit of the leadership structure here. There's a structure of leaders. Elders must oversee the people, must tend to them. They must not be after their own game. And they need to be an example to others, and the younger ones need to respect the elders. And then he finally says, humble yourself, cast your anxiety on him, discipline yourself, and stay alert. So, how will they respond when society will despise you and bring false charges against you? Build a complex state of mind, arm yourself with the same intentions with each other, so that you can have solidarity in your teachings and solidarity with each other. He ends with a farewell with a lot of familial language, and to the apostolic co-worker, Silvanus. Talks about Mark, John Mark, which is like a son to him. John Mark was very much like Timothy was to Paul, a co-worker. We know, of course, that John Mark went on to write the Gospel of Mark, which is really just an expanded kerygma statement from the 5 sermons, 5 messages in Acts that Peter said that Luke records us. If you just take that formula here, right here, if you take this formula and like an accordion, just pull it apart, you can see how John writes the Gospel of Mark, because he just fills in all of those sections right here in the Gospel of Mark. And then he says the church as a sister to them, and stand fast in these instructions. So this is the book of 1 Peter. He gives us his purpose right out in the start here. It's part of the Petrine circle of letters, which includes James and Jude. It's part of the whole canonical section of letters, or Corpus Apostolicum, which includes the letters of John. But then the 3 sections in 1 Peter: living hope, living stones, living as God's household, and then solidarity and community by all of us building a complex state of mind, being able to deal with all the complexities that life and our cities and communities throw at us to honor Christ. Okay, until next time.